everybody, and welcome to our webinar on supplementing your cow herd, managing the pregnant cow for better calf performance. I'm Stacey Domalewski. I'm the Research and Innovation Coordinator for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. Our session tonight should last for approximately 1 hour, but may go a little longer depending on the number of questions you have during the question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet along with us using #BeefWebinar. We will be recording tonight's session, and we'll send out a link, send out an email with a link to watch the recording to everyone who's registered in the next couple of days. So if you missed hearing anything tonight and want to watch it again later, you can, or if you want to pass it along to friends or neighbors you think would get value out of this. So of course, for tonight's webinar, you're going to be able to hear and see our presenters, but we can't hear and see you. So if you want to communicate with us, just type into the small Q&A window that should be on the side of your screen somewhere, either the top or the bottom. And if you have comments for me or our presenter tonight, that's where we'll do it. Feel free to send in any of your questions in that little Q&A box at any point in time, but we'll answer them all towards the end of the hour. So with that, let's get started here. So here's what we'll be covering. We're going to hear from Katie Wood today, and as I said, we'll be taking your questions towards the end of the webinar here. So with that, we'll get started. Our presenter for the evening is Dr. Katie Wood. She is an assistant professor in ruminant nutrition and physiology in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. So staying up late with us tonight. Outside of research, Katie raises and markets purebred Simmental cattle and pulls Dorset sheep. Katie also was a mentee in the Cattlemen's Young Leaders program, and tonight she'll be speaking about supplementing the pregnant cow and calf for better performance. So I will hand it over to you there, Katie.
All right, sure. Oh, we might have to just switch the screen there.
Yeah. There we go. You should be able to share now, I think.
Yes.
All right.
All right. So good evening, everyone. So tonight I'm going to share some thoughts and some new areas of research looking at how what we feed our pregnant cows and how that can impact their offspring and their future performance of the offspring. So I think to get rolling, we'll start with a couple of poll questions. So Stacey, I'm not sure if you can pull up our questions there.
Yeah, so the first poll question here, you should be able to see. So it should say on your screen, what I feed my pregnant cow can impact future performance of her calf. Yes, no, or no idea are your options there. And we'll give them a few minutes here to give their answers. All right, so it looks like most of people have voted here, so I'll give you a second or two more. All right. So.
All right, most people said yes, thank goodness. So hopefully I'll share some cool things that we're learning about this area. So our next poll question, have you ever heard of fetal or developmental programming?
All right, so once again, it looks like we've kind of got everybody's votes coming in. I'll give you a second or two to get any last minute votes. And there you go.
All right, a little bit more split here. A couple people not sure how it applies to beef cattle. Hopefully I'll be able to change your mind. Some have only heard about it in passing, and hopefully you'll get a little bit better understanding. And then about another third have no idea what it's about. So hopefully I can change that as well by the end of the webinar. Okay. So just a quick outline in my presentation. Of course, we'll start with a little bit of definitions on what is fetal and developmental programming. They are very similar things, and we'll talk a little bit about what they are and what they mean. And then I'll go through and give you some examples in the literature of what we know and how that can impact reproduction in beef cattle, how it can impact carcass traits, and a little bit on what we know about how it can impact feed efficiency and growth. And then I'll share a little bit about what my group is working on. We're looking at late gestation protein supplementation and share a few of our results going forward. And then I'll do a little bit of crystal ball gazing and try and give you some thoughts about how we can use this new area of research in the future, and hopefully some ways that it can really benefit beef producers. But I have to apologize, there's no golden bullet answers here in the presentation. Hopefully I'll give you lots of things to think about and maybe a few things to try out on your own operation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what is fetal or developmental programming. So back when I was in school, and that wasn't really that long ago, we learned that the phenotype of the animal, or the set of all her traits, is a combination of her genetics, so her DNA and her genes and every little combination of her genetic code, as well as how she interacts in the environment. And so, of course, the environment could be anything from feed or diet, could be health events, it could be stress or stressful situations, anything like that. But as we kind of learned a little bit more, and even in the past 20, 25 years or so, we've started to learn more and more about that interaction between the genes itself, as well as the environment. And we're starting to learn that that environment that that animal is in can actually have some permanent and lasting changes on the genetic code itself. We think some of these changes may be permanent and may even be heritable from generation to generation. And so a lot of the things we talk about are surrounding this interaction between the animal's genes and the environment that they're raised in. So in this new field of study, there's, as I say, it's only really started to take off in the past 20 or so years. There's a few different fields of research within this area. Certainly we can start to understand how what the animal eats today impacts its genes and the expression of its genes. So for example, tonight for supper I had a hamburger, and presumably we could take a sample of my DNA and start to learn the impact of that hamburger had on my DNA right today. And that's basically the concept of you are what you eat. And we call that field nutrigenomics or nutrigenetics. But we can look at this a little bit further. We can actually take it one step back and try and understand what the impact of pregnancy and gestation and what the mother consumed and the stresses that the mother encountered during that gestation period and how that can influence the offspring. And that is the field that we call fetal programming or developmental programming. And we could take this even further, actually. And so, as I mentioned, we think that some of these changes on those genes can actually be heritable They may even be permanent. And we refer to that field of study as epigenetics. And so you may have heard that term before. So epi comes from the Greek, and it really literally means above or beyond. And so the study of epigenetics is really above or beyond the genetics of the animal. And so you could think about that as you are what your grandmother ate. All right, so I love a good analogy. And so I was thinking about kind of the best way to explain how some of these changes occur. And so this made me think of game Plinko. If you're around my age and you've ever stayed home from school sick on the couch and your mom let you watch some TV, you might have seen the game show The Price is Right. And one of the games on there was Plinko, where the contestants took these discs or pucks and they dropped them down the pegboard to land in one of the different slots corresponding to a different dollar value that they would win. Now we could think about this a little bit like an animal's life cycle. So certainly early on in the fetal period, kind of when they're newborn in the neonatal period, as well down further the board into the growing period. And we can think of our different categories here as maybe a type of ideal phenotype we want to produce in our cattle. So for example, over here we might have the ideal feedlot cattle. So one that's feed efficient, one that's grows quickly, one that puts on a lot of marbling, and maybe not a lot of external fat. And so if we think of the animal as it goes through its life, it will go through the pegboard and it will counter some of these stresses sort of at random, which will redirect where that animal may come out in terms of its phenotype. And so most of these events are at random, things that we can't have a lot of control over, but we're starting to learn that we may actually be able to influence some of that direction a little bit. And so if we can add or remove some of these pegs, and we can learn a little bit more about where we need to remove or add these pegs, we might actually be able to redirect where that chip ends up. So if we know a little bit about what happens in the fetal period and the neonatal period, we may be able to help direct that animal as it matures more towards that ideal phenotype. And so really the questions are, what do we do to add or remove these pegs or disruptions in the animal's life cycle? And secondly, the question is, what are these disruptions made of? Certainly as a nutritionist, we focus on nutrition. And so in today's webinar, we'll focus mostly on some of those nutritional interferences. Okay, we do actually know a little bit about where some of these important traits are developing, particularly in the fetal development of these developing calves. And so this is an image I borrowed from a study by Min Du out of Wyoming. He's probably one of the leaders in this area, particularly related around carcass traits. So I modified this a little bit. Certainly in early life, we have a lot of development of, first of all, the uterus and the placenta. Kind of towards the end of the first trimester, we start to see development of the organs in that fetus, including the testes and the ovary. So certainly that's important when we think about reproductive health. For females, a little bit later, we have primordial follicle development, which is where all of those developing eggs are basically set for the animal's life. And that occurs in the late first trimester and beginning of the second trimester. And certainly relating to some of our muscle traits, In the late part of the first trimester, early part of the second trimester, we have development of all our muscle cells, starting with the primary myocytes and then our secondary myocytes. So these basically set the number of muscle fibers that that animal will have when it's an adult. Now, a little bit later on in a third trimester, we start to see development of our fat cells. So this is really important because this is where our marbling comes from. So if we have disruptions to the growth of the fetus in the early part of this period, we could potentially impact our marbling in those animals. We also have further development of our muscle cells. So although in second trimester we stop seeing the growth of the individual cells, number of cells themselves, in a third trimester we start to see growth of those cells. And then after the animal is born, both in our fat cells and in our muscle cells, we don't see a lot of growth in the number of cells, but mostly in the size of those cells. And so that continues to grow as our calf grows after birth. I've got a lactocrine system on here as well, because certainly when we're thinking about supplementing a cow, particularly in late gestation, you have to remember that she's also starting to make colostrum and milk, and there's a lot of other growth factors in that colostrum besides some of those immune factors that actually we were learning might have a really important role in the development of that calf early on. And so even in that late part of the third trimester, that colostrum development could be key as well. So just to recap, during the development of the fetus, we have all these kind of key areas where different systems are starting to develop. And if we have a stress event occurring during any of these times, we could potentially impact the development of any of these systems. And so really, when we're studying this field, we're trying to look at the timing of stress events as well as the duration of when they occur. And so our stressors, of course, as I mentioned, could be environmental, things like heat stress. We've seen some interesting work in dairy cattle relating to heat stress and some fetal programming results. Cold stress potentially as well. Certainly any health events, so if the cow herself becomes ill, certainly that can impact the development of that fetus. But certainly as a nutritionist in the field that I'm more interested in, and potentially as producers we might be able to have a little bit more control over, is the nutritional impacts on that animal. So some of the common ones that we study as stressors could be nutrient restriction, whether that be intentional or not intentional. We'll talk about what I mean by that in a few slides here. This could be protein or even components of protein like amino acids. This could be fat impacts, whether it be level of fat itself or the type of fat, whether it's polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat, so our high omega-3, omega-6 ratio fat, as well as some potential mineral interactions as well. One of the most that's been studied is selenium, but we won't have time to get into a lot of those today. All right, so let's talk about a few examples of how this might actually impact the cow herd. So I pulled a couple of examples from a couple of different economically relevant traits. So this first one is looking at the effects on reproduction. So this was a study done out of Nebraska. It was a 3-year study with 170 Hereford cross Mark II composite cows. And they supplemented these cows with 2 different factors, being a supplement occurring in late gestation, so that was 60 days before calving, And during that intervention, cows were either supplemented just under half a kilo of cottonseed meal-based protein supplement 3 times a week, or they didn't receive a supplement. And during this time, they were grazing dormant range, and so that range would have been about 6% crude protein or so on that grassland. They also looked at if supplementing those animals after calving and early lactation had any influence as well. And so in this case, after the cows calved, they were either divided into a meadowgrass pasture or received a cool season hay in a dry lot. So then the females from these cows, so their daughters, after calving and after our lactation intervention, they were managed together as a group, so nothing about the management changed. And then as yearlings, they were exposed to a bull for a 45-day breeding season. All right, and let's see what happened to those daughters. So even though our supplemented cows received a little bit more protein during late gestation, didn't have any impact at all on the birth weight of those animals. Now, this is where it starts to get a lot more interesting, is at weaning, even though those daughters were managed together as a group, those daughters that were born from supplemented cows were heavier at weaning. They also were heavier at pre-breeding and heavier at pregnancy check. So all throughout kind of the later part of their life cycle, they were heavier. Now this is where it gets more interesting. Those daughters, 93% of them were pregnant that were born from supplemented dams, whereas only 80% of those daughters became pregnant if they were born from non-supplemented dams. This also influenced the calving distribution as well, where 77% calved in those first 21 days, whereas only just under 50 calved in the first 21 days if they were from a non-supplemented dam. So some big differences here, certainly likely having some long-term effects on those daughters in terms of their longevity in the herd. Now, I didn't show any data from this, but interestingly, they found that there was no difference with any of the parameters they measured looking at if they were supplemented in early lactation. So this is something that's happening for sure in that last 60 days or so before those animals were born. All right, another study, switching gears a little bit, talking about carcass quality. So this study was done again out of Wyoming and South Dakota. And this study again looked at a protein supplement, but this time rather than providing a supplement, they looked at switching the animals from a winter range to an improved pasture. So these cows were managed as a group on winter range until about day 120 of gestation. And then half of those cows were switched to an improved pasture, which was a wild rye and wheatgrass-based pasture system, which was about 11% protein versus the about 6.5% on the winter range. And they stayed on that improved pasture for 60 days. Then those cows were allowed to calve, and they took the steer calves from these animals, managed them together as a group, and fed them out until slaughter. And so they also found some really interesting things as well. Again, no difference on birth weight from those two treatments. But once those animals started to get a little bit older, we saw that those animals that were born from mothers that spent 60 days on that improved pasture were heavier at weaning. Then into the feeding period and the finishing period, they had higher average daily gain. And so that translated into higher body weight at slaughter, higher carcass weight, and they also had more fat over their 12th rib, so they had more rib fat. They also tended to have a little bit higher marbling score as well. And so these researchers, they actually took this one step further and looked at some of the marbling traits. And so they took some meat samples, cut some histology slides to look at the actual structure of some of the fat tissue. And what they found was really interesting. So regardless of whether they were on that improved pasture or their mothers were on the native range, the size of the fat cells didn't really change. But what they did see was that those steers that were born from mothers that were on that improved pasture for 60 days actually had more fat cells. And so this shows that they have the potential for a much higher level of marbling than their counterparts that were just grazed on native range. And so back to our diagram, if we just think about this for a second. So our red bar here is where that nutrient intervention occurred. And remember what I was saying about this area here is the start of the development of some of that marbling. And sure enough, right at the beginning of this is where those animals received that additional improved rangeland, which was a higher protein rangeland. And so certainly likely impacting the ability of those animals to deposit marbling later in life. Okay, so that's another example. So this one here is a more recent one. This one was done actually in Saskatchewan. And they were looking at the impact on growth of offspring that were born from mothers that were supplemented with a fat supplement. So this was done over 3 years. And they had 3 groups of animals they were evaluating. They were fed fat supplement over the 2nd and 3rd trimester, so about 160 days or so leading up to calving. A control group or low fat group was about 1.5% fat in the diet, or a high fat group, which was canola seed based, which is a source of monounsaturated fats, or a high fat flaxseed pellet based ration, which is the source of polyunsaturated fat as well. And so both these high fat rations, regardless of the type of fat, were about twice the amount of fat as the low fat ration. And then after calving, the mothers were fed the same diet, and they evaluated the steer progeny in terms of performance. So they saw some interesting things. In this study, I liked it as well because they also followed the performance of the cows quite closely. And so what we saw was some interesting results there. The low-fat cows, they were actually heavier going into calving. So they were heavy in terms of body weight. They also were higher body condition scored than the high-fat group. This was a little bit different than what they thought. And they thought that maybe those high-fat cows weren't stimulated to eat as much forage, and so they didn't eat as much forage as the lower-fat cows, and that's why the low-fat cows benefited by that forage and put that into body reserves. Interestingly as well, this had some impacts on the cow pregnancy rate as well, where those low-fat fed cows tended to have a lower pregnancy rate than the high-fat group, so the opposite of the condition. But if we look at this closer, there wasn't any difference in the calving rate or the distribution of when those calves were born in the calving period. But we did see a whole lot of differences in those offspring. So again, they were fed, those mothers were fed their high-fat or low-fat diets up until calving. After calving, they were switched onto a common diet and raised as a group. But we saw that birth weight, weight at day 42, adjusted weaning weight, as well as the weights throughout the backgrounding and finishing period, were all higher in animals that were fed high-fat diets, or animals whose mothers were fed high-fat diets. This also translated into some finishing differences. So shrunk body weight was greater, hot carcass weight was greater, but we didn't see any differences in dressing percent or yield or quality grade in this study. We definitely saw some differences between low-fat steers born from low-fat mothers or fed mothers, or steers born from high-fat fed mothers, but they didn't see any differences between the source of fat, whether that was a canola seed-based fat source or flaxseed based fat source. So again, another example of some of those differences that we see based on our maternal diet. All right, and so moving on to another area, this time looking at efficiency. This area is a little tougher to navigate. Certainly efficiency is a very complicated trait, likely a lot of different factors contributing to this. But there is a theory in fetal programming type research that kind of supports this notion of efficiency. And it stems out of some of the census data from the Dutch famine that was developed by David Barker, who's an epidemiologist out of England. And he kind of coined this thrifty phenotype hypothesis, or sometimes it's referred to as the Barker hypothesis. And it was out of data, again, from the Dutch famine. So women who were pregnant between November 1944 and the spring of 1945. This is when there were, in the war, they cut off all food supplies to the Netherlands, and so these people were essentially starving. They were eating, sometimes it's called the tulip famine, because they were eating tulip bulbs, eating as little as 500 calories a day, so like a quarter of what a human adult typically needs. What they found with this census data is that people that were born whose mothers were pregnant during this time and exposed to this famine actually were at significantly higher risks for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and a lot of other health issues associated with metabolic syndrome. And what they thought was this was preparing that developing baby, that developing fetus, for a world that was low in nutrition, because they were restricted so severely when their mother was pregnant. And so the theory with this is that undernutrition at some of these key points actually is a bit of a mismatch for the nutrition that those people were exposed to once they were born. And as a result, we get this big increase in storage of energy in offspring. And the storage of energy, of course, is related to fat. And so we call this a little bit of a metabolic mismatch between the environment that the developing embryo is expecting versus the reality of the energy available to that baby or calf when it's born. And so this is a theory that's being investigated for the study of efficiency. And I'll give you a little bit of examples for some work that we've been involved with. So this was a study done with Carolyn Fitzsimmons at the University of Alberta, and it was based on a global nutrient restriction of cows fed between 150 and 250 days of gestation. So the last part of the second trimester and the first part of the third trimester. And cows were restricted to either 85% of their requirements, so fairly mild restriction, or they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, which was about 140% of their total nutrient requirements. And in this case, we actually ended up slaughtering these cows, and we were looking at the development of the fetus at day 250, and we took a lot of samples of fetal tissues and looked at changes in expression for some of these genes that we know are related to some of our efficiency traits. So again, we wanted to make sure that we weren't stunting growth, and so we measured the fetal weight, of course, but we also looked at the crown rump length as well as the thorax circumference, and which are typical signs of growth stunting. So if you've had a baby, ever had a child in the hospital, one of the first things they do is measure the crown rump and thoracic circumference, just as an indication if any severe growth stunting has occurred. Certainly if we stunt growth too severely, those offspring have a hard time recovering from that. So in this case, again, we didn't change fetal weight or any of our measures of growth stunting. But what we did see is in the expression of some of our genes relating to some of our growth and efficiency traits, and the names of the genes are not important, as well as we looked at some muscle development genes as well. But what you can see is a large trend across all these results is that mothers that were fed that restricted diet, their offspring has increased expression on almost all of these genes. So we think that certainly they're priming those fetuses to be highly metabolically active in these genes, and so they'll be more efficient once they are born. So again, kind of tying in with that thrifty phenotype hypothesis that I explained earlier. All right, so those are a couple of examples that we can see in the literature. And now I'll show you a couple of things that we've been working on, particularly around late gestation protein supplementation. So some of the examples I showed you already are looking at this, and we're starting to look at a little more detail in this as well. So one thing that we know in late gestation is that once we're kind of after 180 days or so of pregnancy, we see this massive exponential growth in the growth of that fetus. So most of the development occurs in that last part of the third trimester. And so with that comes a lot of demand for nutrients with the fetus. So we need a lot of protein to support growth, certainly requires a lot more energy for the cow, as certainly a lot more mineral as well for bone development. And we know a little bit that the cow herself actually might have to change her own metabolism in order to shuttle nutrients towards that developing calf. And so in the literature, we can see that during this period, this cow actually may use some of her own muscle reserves even to shuttle those nutrients towards that developing calf, and even burn some of their reserves in the muscle just to get energy to support that dramatic growth in the last part of gestation. And so really the question is, certainly if that's too severe for the cow, it can damage herself and her future milk production, but also it might be beneficial for her and for the calf if we add more protein to the diet during this last part of gestation. And so this is one of the questions we're looking at. So in the literature, I showed you some examples already, but certainly there's a lot of range studies out there where research groups have supplemented protein on cattle grazing on native ranges, and widely across the board they see increased cow performance. But one of the challenges as well is if you're adding a protein supplement, you're also adding a little bit of energy with that as well. So we're not exactly sure whether it's the added energy or the protein that's making those differences in terms of cow performance. The other thing as well in a lot of these range studies, as I mentioned, that we're typically between about 5 and 6.5% crude protein. which for a late gestation cow would be a deficiency for her stage of production. Normally we're looking around 7.5 or 8, ideally to meet her energy requirements. So a lot of these might be actually just correcting a deficiency rather than an oversupply of that protein. So that's one thing we need to investigate further. Certainly all these fetal programming effects that we've been talking about already might be of interest. And as well as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, we think there could be some impacts on colostrum quality and quantity. Certainly some research in lambs has shown this to be the case. And certainly we've seen some other fetal programming type research, although they didn't measure it directly. They noted that steers born from mothers that were supplemented during late gestation actually had a lower incidence of BRD once they reached the feedlot. So there certainly could be an interaction there with animal health and immune response in some of that offspring also. I also mentioned that colostrum is not just about antibodies. There's also a lot of growth factors. And certainly if we can influence some of those growth factors, we could supply those young calves with a little bit of a energy boost in terms of those growth factors in the colostrum naturally. So one of the studies we did, this was done with Corinne Hare, oh, excuse me, who's a PhD student here at Guelph and was a master's student in Saskatchewan. And we fed 24 Hereford Cross heifers about 7 weeks before calving. We either fed them at their protein requirements or 133% of their requirements. So in this case, we're looking at an oversupply and not correcting a deficiency. These calves were all bred to the same bull. And we followed the calves till day 112, and we took some muscle biopsies on day 2 of those calves' lives and just before the end of the study. And we actually looked at some genes relating to growth and development as well. And we did see some interesting results. So certainly, even with just 7 weeks of supplementation, we did see an interaction with the fat level in that colostrum, where the animals that were fed high protein actually had reduced fat, which might be of interest because that's supplying less energy to that calf at birth. Again, just like all our other studies that I've shown you so far, we didn't impact the birth weight at all on these calves. And at least in our following them to day 112, we didn't see any performance differences in those heifers born from these cows either. But we did see some differences in some of our gene expression in our muscle. So our high protein calves, we think that we're influencing this gene PPAR gamma, which is another gene that we know is involved with the development of fat and fat cells. So we think we might be improving marbling potentially, and these in heifers that were born from calves receiving additional protein. But we did see some differences as well in our adequate protein calves, where this gene here, PKM, influences a metabolic pathway involved with glucose synthesis, which may actually improve energy cycling in that animal. So kind of 2 different results, but certainly also may indicate that we're having an impact with oversupply of protein, not just under fixing that restriction. In another study we're doing, and we're just kind of finishing up this one here, we looked at, again, protein requirements. And in this case, we had 6 different groups of animals. We either fed them a 10% restriction at their protein requirements or 10% higher than their protein requirements. But we also fed them an amino acid, methionine. So in forage-fed animals, the amino acid methionine is likely one of the limiting amino acids. We know in dairy cattle that if we supply some methionine, we can actually improve performance over the transition period. And so we thought that we would try that out in beef cattle as well. And so at each of our 3 protein levels, we either provided additional methionine or we did not. In this study, we had 150 cows, and again, we fed them just 8 weeks before calving, and we controlled the energy and feed intake in this diet. And so really focused only on those protein differences. We measured the cow performance as well as looked at the colostrum and calf health, and we evaluated the heifers after weaning for growth, and we just finished finishing our steers and looked at their performance in the feedlot as well as their carcass traits. And so some things that we saw, kind of as we'd expect, even with a mild protein restriction, those cows did lose more weight than our adequate or 110% fed cows, which maybe is not that surprising. It also impacted their digestibility. So we did measure how well they were able to digest their forage diet, and those cows receiving the lowest protein did have poor digestibility as well. So that's something to consider. But we adding our methionine supplement didn't really have an impact on any of the weight loss characteristics we measured in our cows or on our digestibility characteristics. But we did look at some of the metabolism within that cow, and although we didn't see any performance differences, we did see that methionine might be helping that cow out in terms of her metabolism. So she had cows that received methionine had higher glucose in their blood, and they had an amino acid profile that was different, supporting a better energy balance in those cows. And so we think that it might be actually changing how those nutrients might be shuttled towards that developing fetus. We also saw some really interesting results looking at colostrum. The methionine was actually not so great on the colostrum. So we had lower urea protein in the colostrum. We also had lower total protein that was measured with a Brix refractometer. And we measured the IgGs in that colostrum as well. And they were lower both in the colostrum itself and in the calf. So certainly that was something we did not expect to find. And we're actually taking a closer look at that now to seeing if those results actually translate into any health differences on those animals. In terms of calf performance, so our heifers, we didn't see any differences on our post-weaning growth. And on our steers, as I say, we're still finishing up the analysis, but we didn't see any differences on growth. But we did see some interesting results with our carcass traits, where our protein level as well impacted the grade fat and the lean yield on some of those animals. So that kind of corresponds to some other results we've seen that I showed you in the literature earlier from that study from Wyoming. All right, and so where is this all going? Where are we going to be using this type of research in the future? So I was thinking about it, and I think there are 2 kind of main approaches into using this type of work. The first is what I call a proactive approach. And so this is very much what I was talking about with my Plinko example, where we're actually trying to move or redirect where those phenotypes of those offsprings might end up. So in this case, maybe we're trying to, again, create the optimum feedlot animal. And so what are the things in that, the whole life cycle of that animal that we can do to try and direct it towards that optimum state? And so that could be for feedlot cattle, or it could be a different program for a replacement heifer. And so potentially we can develop a standard operating procedure to feed that cow right from the day of conception right out until that animal's ready for harvest. So that's what I call the proactive approach. But there's another reason for studying this as well, and with some of the crazy weather we've been having lately, certainly is becoming more and more relevant. This is what I call the reactive approach, and basically trying to understand how some of these environmental or stress effects impact the programming, and if there are ways that we can manage these results or even redirect or fix these results accordingly. And so I just, for an example, I pulled this paper, which was a really interesting data set. This is actually from Mexico, and it was a retroactive study, or retrospective study. And so they actually looked back at 46 years of calving data in the Mexican desert, and they classified animals, whether they were born or whether gestation occurred, whether they had high rainfall, low rainfall, or average rainfall, and whether that rainfall occurred early during gestation or late during gestation. And so for a little bit of an activity here, we'll see what you guys think happened to those daughters based on what I've hopefully taught you already. So what do you think the impact of drought would be on those progeny in this study? So is it drought early in pregnancy will decrease pregnancy rate in daughters? Drought during late pregnancy will decrease pregnancy rates in daughters? Or do you think it doesn't have an impact on reproduction at all? Or again, you have no idea? So give a few minutes to vote.
Lots of answers coming in here. I'll give you guys a few more seconds here to pick which answer you think it is. All right.
All right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
About half split between early pregnancy and half split between late in pregnancy. All right, well, let's have a look at the results and see who's right. Okay, so this is a table from the study, and just to orient you a little bit. So these are the treatments, so that's lower than average rainfall, or high level of rainfall. And the data here is, so the daughter's reproductive performance. So these are daughters born from cows that were essentially fetuses during these different levels of rainfall. And whether that rainfall occurred in early gestation or late gestation. So going through the results, we could see that age at first calving, there was no impact on rainfall on the age of first calving. Now, when we look at the percent of 2-year-olds that calved, we could see there's a little bit of a bad news for those animals that had drought in early gestation. They actually had lower percentage of those females calved as a 2-year-old if they were exposed to drought during early gestation. But it actually looks quite different in terms of longevity. So if you were able to overcome that lower pregnancy rate as a 2-year-old, you're at 8 years old, you're way likely to still remain in the herd and have almost 2 calves more than other animals at average or high rainfall. So just to summarize this a little bit, so these animals that were exposed to drought in early gestation were likely difficult to get into calf initially as a 2-year-old, but certainly after 8 years and the total number of calves that they produced in their lifetime certainly supports the notion of longevity. And this kind of, again, supports that thrifty phenotype hypothesis. So although, again, tough overcoming that 2-year-old, getting pregnant as a 2-year-old, Likely these animals are a little bit tougher and a little bit more resilient and able to stay in the herd longer for these producers. So super interesting study, and I thought with some really interesting results. Certainly just a little bit of a survey, so really need to understand why that's happening, and hopefully this research group is following up with that. Okay, so just as we finished up here, some take-home messages. So again, I hope this webinar, if anything else, really demonstrated to you that what you feed those pregnant cows matters much more than you think, and it's likely to have some fairly long-term impacts on your herd, whether it be in the feedlot or on those replacement females. And so hopefully as we move forward and kind of learn more about this, we will be able to generate some of those multi-generational feeding programs, or develop some of those standard operating procedures for feeding those animals, and hopefully be able to target kind of key outcomes, whether it be ideal feedlot or replacement heifers, as well as how we fix environmental interferences, things like drought or heat stress or cold stress. So that's hopefully the goal we're working towards. But very much still a work in progress. Certainly we know a lot about the timing of some of these stresses, which I showed you in that diagram. And we know that when some of those nutritional insults occur, can really matter and change some of those outcomes. But a lot of these studies we have to be careful as well, because some of them use a nutrient restriction model. And although I've showed you a lot of data following the calf, we still need to think about the dam herself and how those restrictions actually impact her performance. So can she get pregnant the following year? What is that doing to her milk performance? That type of things. Sometimes we also see some conflicting theories. So I showed you a lot about protein supplementation, particularly in late gestation. But then on the other hand, we have the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, which may favor nutrient restriction at some form or another. Likely neither of these alone is correct, and probably a combination of the two, depending on things like timing and duration, are likely to yield the best outcome, but we still need much more research to kind of study that combination. Also, which nutrients are key is important. So we talked a lot about protein, and protein by far is probably where most of the research has happened in the past 15 years or so. But I did show you some others, particularly around fat. I mentioned selenium is interesting, and there's groups out of Missouri and out of North Dakota which are looking at selenium supplementation, which has some promising results as well. But we need to understand which are the key nutrients to target. We also don't know how recoverable some of these impacts are, and so whether that relates to drought or whether that relates to changing some of our outcomes after a fetal programming event, we still need to do a little bit of work on that. I mentioned the role of colostrum. We're just starting to learn that can have a big influence as well, and may be another avenue to kind of program some growth traits into some of these cattle. And as well, kind of finishing up here, we certainly don't know a lot about the heritability of some of these changes. So I mentioned the field of epigenetics at the start, and oftentimes in a lot of these trials, certainly they're terminal at the end of steer performance, but it's presumable that some of these traits may even be longer lasting than that, and even may carry down to a second generation. And so that's something that simply needs to be researched a little bit more in terms of beef cattle production. So I know I've thrown a whole lot of data at you, but hopefully you'll be able to pique your interest a little bit at some of these things, and certainly start thinking about some supplementation programs and those long-term impacts it might have on your cow herd.
Thanks very much. That was super interesting. We've got a few questions already coming in here. So the first one here that came in, and I think you kind of answered this in your, what do we need to know section, but is around, is protein the most important thing that we should be making sure we are supplementing with? So just to clarify, sorry, for everybody, if you want to ask a question, there is on the bottom of your screen or on the top somewhere, there'll be a little box that says Q&A, and you can type into that box and send in your question. So we've got a few here already, but if you want to get yours in before the end of the webinar here, make sure you do it that way. So sorry, Katie.
Yeah, so protein supplementation by far is the one that's the most studied, and probably the one that we probably should focus on the most, at least in terms of late gestation. So as I mentioned earlier, the nutrient demand on the cow as that calf is growing exponentially during the last 100 days or so of gestation, that can be detrimental to the cow herself, but also can impact the calf. And as we're learning more and more, particularly with the work out of Wyoming, that it can actually have some big impacts on carcass quality and reproduction as well. So if we're going to supplement right now, I would say that protein is the one to target, and primarily in late gestation, we want to make sure that we're at least meeting our requirements for our pregnant cow. And we're learning more about oversupply, but certainly undersupply of protein seems to negatively impact some of those carcass and performance and reproductive traits.
So is there any work on organic versus inorganic minerals fed to the dam, and if that impacts the offspring? Have you heard anything about that?
There is a little bit just starting. So I believe that Allison Mayer's group out of Missouri is looking at exactly that with selenium specifically. So whether it's selenomethionine, which would be an organic source of selenium, versus an inorganic source of selenium, and how that impacts some of the performance traits. Certainly we know with an organic source that there is a lot higher rate of absorption by the animal, and so presumably we would see higher absorption with organic sources. But in terms of long-term performance, I don't have any data to share with you yet, but I know they're working on it.
Okay, thanks. So this one about the example you gave at the end. So do you think that the drought stress in the first trimester, when the development of ovaries was occurring, was in fact removing animals from the herd that had other genetic ovary defects, so only the superior genetically predisposed animals remained? So essentially they're asking, like, did, how they paraphrased, in short, did it reduce the genetically inferior animals in the first year?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. Certainly, it's a large data set. 46 years worth of data is a lot to look at, but I think it's probably related to something like that as well. So again, yeah, eliminating those animals that had issues to begin with, and yeah, kind of bringing to the surface those animals that were a little hardier, even in terms of their reproductive development itself.
Okay, a few more questions here. So we've got quite a few coming in, but if you have one, get it in fairly quickly because we'll cut it off fairly soon. But can a short-term restriction fool the programming before it gets to the point of actually harming the cow or fetal development, so it can trick it into some of the positive benefits?
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going to try next with some of those thrifty phenotype hypothesis approaches. So certainly restriction on the long term, we know that can stunt growth on the calf and that type of thing, which is certainly something we don't want to do. But we think maybe playing with some of those very short restriction periods might be able to trigger some of that phenotype hypothesis. So it might not be just, it might be more of a riding the roller coaster rather than a constant level of restriction.
Okay. Thanks for that. For the next one here, so on a practical basis, would energy restriction make the most sense in mid-gestation? So I'm assuming they're asking it as if you had to energy restrict, when's the best time?
Yes, and absolutely. I think I've got another backup slide here to show you.
Oh, sorry, Katie, I'll just get you to share your screen again. I just
Oh yeah, sure. Threw a couple of extras in here. Ah, there we go. Whoop. Yes, so certainly this is energy requirements for heifers. Our baseline requirements for maintenance, for heifers, of course, we've got some energy required for growth. And then as those animals become pregnant, their energy requirements to support the pregnancy also increase. Now, if we're dealing with a cow, we've got lactation on top of that. And so certainly in that mid-gestation period, particularly for cows where requirements are low for lactation, for cows we won't have any growth requirements, but they're also fairly low for that developing calf. That is likely the best time to impose a restriction if you need to do so, because you're less likely to impact some of this exponential growth that happens in late gestation. So yes, I agree that it should, mid-gestation is probably the time to energy restrict if you have to.
Okay, a few more questions here and then we'll shut it off. Will the protein supplementation in late gestation also make changes to meat tenderness, not just marbling?
Yes, and there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that it actually does improve tenderness. I have a summer student that is working on a fourth-year project to look at that right now, actually. So I've got steaks from our steers, and we'll be measuring that in the next couple weeks here. So stay tuned, I guess. But certainly in the literature, there seems to be indication that that's the case as well.
Okay, so just a few more questions here. Is the protein supplement affecting gut flora and digestion, or simply just increasing the available protein, or do we know?
So combination of probably all those things. Certainly looking at forms of protein, whether it's degradable in the rumen or undegradable, still hasn't been investigated yet. It's certainly impacting probably all things. So in our study, for example, we did see improvement with digestibility as well, which is also likely helping energy also. It's more than just sheer protein itself. Yeah, impacts the whole body system also. So it's probably not simply protein that it's changing.
Okay, so another question kind of along the lines of that. Does a favorable body condition score on a breeding animal buffer perhaps an undersupply of protein during a certain gestation period of the developing fetus, opposed to essentially a lower body condition score but a higher level of protein at a feeding period?
Yeah, certainly body condition score is an important factor in this. Maybe not as much for protein, but certainly for energy. If an animal needs to mobilize some of its energy stores, it can do that from those body condition, their body condition. If they need a source of protein, it has to come from muscle, and the animal can mobilize muscle, but it also is sacrificing other parts, other requirements for protein if it needs to do that. Body condition is probably more related to energy than protein, but it's an important consideration as well.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Katie, for taking the time to answer those questions. I think we will leave it there for the night, but I do have a few more things to let everybody know about before we close things down here. So the first is how to get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to our website, beefresearch.ca, and you can click on the subscribe button, and it'll allow you to sign up for our free email list, as well as if you have Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you can connect with us there as well. Just to tell everybody, our next webinar is actually coming up right away here. We didn't want to get too close to Christmas, so it's coming up here in next week, and it's Genomics 101. So it'll be November 26th, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Steve Miller, who's the Director of Genetic Research for Angus Genetics, Inc. So just to let everybody know, within the next few days, you're going to receive an email with with a link to watch the recording, as well as links to some additional information on the topic that we've been covering today. And you'll also receive a link to a survey. If you can take the time to fill that survey out, it really helps us. It's what directs future webinar topics and really helps us to make information that is relevant to you and your operation. So that's it. I want to thank all of you at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everybody, thank you, Katie, for taking the time to do the webinar today. Bye.
Bye.